Chapter 1. Welcome to the jungle. The truce holds by a thread. The throne revolves, and some monarchs are easier to deal with than others. One morrow, sometime in the future, the crown will settle upon the brow of one black prince or another, and at his side will be an equally terrible queen. Mark my words, we will soon be back in the old days and up to our lips in blood. Monsignor Sulci Tavana. Letters to the College. Penned PA 296.
Kaboom! I shouted as the world went dark. My words dropped flat into the featureless void that wrapped hot and claustrophobic around me. The deafening fusillade of ultrasonic arrows was gone. The tortured cracking of wood and roar of a swelling inferno vanished from my ears. And for 1.241 seconds, there was nothing but the pounding of my heart, the sweltering heat of the Jupiter impeller in my hand, and the empty infinity. Dimension shifting was always a weird experience. Of course, my physics professor would have been quite irritated at my use of the words.
The distortion shield simply wraps you in a bubble of curved space. You are not leaving our dimension, you're just hiding in a little mouse hole for a few seconds.
Daniel Alster's words, one of my few complete memories of my time in seminary, echoed in my ears as the world popped back into existence. Wondrous chaos everywhere. The jungle was afire for kilometers in every direction, and everything within 100 meters of the impact point was simply gone. A dozen glowing craters stippled the land where I had been just moments before. The jump I had started just seconds before the barrage had hit was coming to an end, and in 2.93 seconds, I was going to impact the ground at 89 kilometers per hour, plenty of time. I swept my eyes across the horizon and saw what I was looking for. Falling like Icarus from the heavens were the bloody remnants of my foe. She had been concealed high above the battlefield in the cloud banks hidden behind an enchanted shroud, and her 1,000 arrows had come down upon me with little warning. That being said, little warning was more than enough for one of my talents. When she had drawn upon the spirits of air and fury to loose the killing volley, the entire sky had shifted ever so slightly, like the chest of a man drawing in a deep breath. Had I merely been good? Those few seconds would have been enough time for me to leap out of the primary impact zone and activate my D-shield. Since I was one of the best, it was also enough time for me to discern the center of the breath, draw a bead on my attacker, and fire off an impeller stream. There was an immense satisfaction in watching the bleeding pieces of her fall like rain onto the jungle below. The extra draw of the cookie cutter attached to my impeller had cost me a few more precious quants than I would have liked, but the effect was worth it. That lovely barrel accessory had twisted the relativistic stream of liquid metal from a micron-thin line into an expanding spiral. From where I stood, the impeller stream was more than capable of carving my name on the moon. At 9 kilometers from the impulse point, it had passed through the supernal warrior's enchanted mail and many layered wardings without even a hint of resistance.
Kill confirmed. Baroness Illuvia, Karasham, Devasti. Stormwaker of the Sixth Order.
The ground rushed upon me as my squad burst into cheers over the communication net. Devasti was a big gun on the other side. She wasn't the toughest in a straight-up brawl, but she was fast, impossible to detect, and the destructive power of her thunderclap arbalest was second to only a few. With the Storm Baroness down and out, the Wild Hunt only had 3 nobles left on the map. The rest of their host were all common supernals, and while a horde of redcaps and trolls was not to be disregarded, they were not a threat on the same level as the peers. We had to press our advantage. With Devasti no longer lurking in the skies, I had a chance to retrieve some of our casualties. Remus and Charm had devastated our front lines earlier in the battle, and we had been forced to abandon the field or face more losses. Lucan's Hollow, where the Alpha Assault and his cohort had met their demise, was now a scarred and blasted field of ash that spread for 10 kilometers in every direction. Without any trees to provide cover from aerial targeting, Devasti had prevented any attempts by our scout elements to retrieve our downed companions. The only good fortune we had had was that the same lack of cover that prevented us from making a foray into the blasted battlefield also foiled any attempts by the hunt to finish off the assault cohort. Our artillery cohort had been devoting most of their power to ripping up any supernal that dared violate the smouldering tree line. I dialed my reactor to maximum dispersal and slammed into the wet soil of the Amazon. My squad was still cheering, and the Baroness had been dead for less than 3 seconds, but I was already moving. When you grasped an advantage, you didn't let it go. The Moebius between my shoulders twisted and pulled as it absorbed the impact, then went rigid as it translated my downward momentum into a titanic leap. I kept the arc of my jump low and let my secondary jets give me the extra speed I needed. I was breaching the canopy of the jungle, but with Devasti eliminated, that was no longer a death sentence. It took 7 long skipping jumps and 1.2 minutes to make the 7.5-kilometer distance to the edge of the still-smoking killing grounds. I was burning red hot and coming close to my maximum safe speed. There was no chance that I wasn't detected. Even with my shroud cloaking me from casual visual detection, I was outputting too much power for that to matter, so I had stopped trying to be subtle. That part of the game was done. I switched my shroud from camouflage to active defense. The light-bending field was now focused on displacing my visual footprint and deflecting hostile directed energy weapons. It took all of a second from when I breached the tree line for the various elements of the hunt to make their presence known. 6 searing wands spoke words of sunfire from across the no-man's land. Most supernals carried a wand of one type or another as a sidearm. They rarely worked, but sometimes they got lucky. One pulse of thermal radiance actually was a dead shot and would have connected, but my shroud bent the beam of light so that it slid off me like I was covered in grease. Supporting fire, trace my line. Caron, 12579. I spoke the words as I made a beeline across the battlefield towards our downed companions, and my artillery cohort responded instantly and without words. The repeater bolts came over the horizon like a storm of fireflies. Each of the tiny, unstable fusion bottles contained an impression of purpose, and they swarmed with an insect-like intelligence. The comms band lit up with the chittering machine speech of the incoming barrage. The supernals tried to flee, but my eyes followed their movements, and the repeater swarm traced my line of sight. By the looks of the fleeing host, the hunt had committed a large blocking force of troll hussars, backed up by a sizable host of worms and zephyrs. It would have been difficult to catch a Templar cohort with such a barrage, but the wild hunt lacked our baseline mobility. The worms rose as one, which it was, weaving itself into a defensive dome over the trolls, while the zephyrs rushed out to meet the incoming missiles. Perhaps they thought to swat them from the sky with their wind magic. Had I not been busy closing the distance to my fallen companions, I would have allowed myself a smile. The boys in artillery had taken my suggestions to heart tweaking their loadout to counter any countermeasures the huntsmen might try to stop the incoming attack. The leading edge of the repeater swarm was composed of a mixture of hummingbird and stooping falcon rounds. The quartet of zephyrs had barely managed to clear the tree line when the 7 Humber bolts surged forward to meet them. Unlike the other repeater bolts in the swarm, these little missiles prioritized speed and accuracy at the cost of explosive power. 100 of them popped like a string of firecrackers around the zephyrs, saturating the area with a heavy morphoactive dust. Magical chaff that acted like an oil slick on the floor for any attempt to cast a spell. It wasn't much, and any competent sorcerer could warp his matrix to overcome the effect. But the zephyrs were neither competent, nor had they the time to blunder their way around the problem. It was like poking a man balanced on a tight rope. A tiny shove, and instead of summoning a monstrous hurricane to batter the missiles into pieces, the storm spirits managed only a paltry gust that barely ruffled feathers. The worms fared no better. Each individual manifestation was like a living cable of steel, hard, supple, and then woven together with a single mind into a living barrier. The stooping falcon, breaching rounds hit the organic wall with a sound that was akin to a book the size of a small boat, being slammed down onto a steel table of similar proportions. The grey wave of interlaced worms shattered into a chaos of shards and wire. Still a formidable barrier, but not the obdurate wall that it had been a millisecond before. Into this milieu crashed the main force of the artillery cohort strike, 700 Merlin high, explosive fusion repeater bolts. Each one was only a decaton or so worth of fusionable energy, but when they all went off together, it was a sight to behold. The shockwave leveled the tree line for another couple of kilometers, and the flare of the nuclear detonation charred the ground around me black, for the second time today. My shroud shunted the burning light of the flash to each side, but the shockwave hit me in the arse and sent me tumbling. I could have engaged the D-shield and popped back out of reality to weather the attack, but I was guessing that I could manage without burning precious quants on an unneeded blink. The world spun as I laughed with exhilaration. The firestorm was next, but I was far enough away that I didn't need to worry about that. I hit the ground running and spared only the slightest backwards glance to double-check my range. The late evening sky was bruised purple with smoke, and the ground blazed with hellish light. A chirp in the back of my mind alerted me to the last arrivals from my artillery support. A slow flight of telemetry hawk-eyes. Unlike the more directly destructive weapons systems that they had deployed in the initial barrage, these late arrivals took a leisurely glide over the battlefield and surveyed the working. They broadcast their findings over our TAC channel and gave us a bird's eye view of the situation. I saw myself racing across the charred soil of Lucan's Hollow, highlighted in angelic white, and I saw the 4 bodies of my fallen assault cohort spread across a 3-kilometer area, highlighted in a helpful green, pinging for help. There were a few pulsing red dots scattered in the still blazing inferno. Hussars whose luck or fire warding was far above average. Skolk's lord and the rest of his artillery cohort would make short work of the crippled survivors. I could already hear the second volley in inbound. Mostly Gerfolkens by the telemetry he was transmitting to me. The man was an asshole who constantly harangued even the slightest mistake, and his whining and second-guessing had nearly driven me to madness. Still, he was alpha artillery for a reason. His loadout choice was impeccable, and while I would pit myself against him in a duel without hesitation, he was a worthy foe. In addition to being a dead shot, he could hide behind a blade of grass. After we had lost Dragon 88 and his assault cohort, it had been Skulk's Lord and myself who had kept our team on the map. I had played tag with the barons of the hunt, while the jackass had danced around beyond maximum range and rained hell on the hunt. He was a lethal ghost, elusive as the morning mist and deadlier than nerve gas. The hunt had lost 2/3 of their cannon fodder simply trying to pin the artillery cohort down. Some credit was due to the engineering cohort and their deadly little toys, but it was Skullek's Lord who had dragged the hunt on a merry chase through the thickest minefields and left them maimed and diminished. Plus, Arsid Awesome was a little shit who barely deserved his alpha designation. It was well known, if not well proven, that he had bought his way into his rank. If we had had competent engineers, then Dragon 88 wouldn't have been on this field with his ass hanging out, when the avalanche in hollow skin and the baying dog of hungry fire pincered his position. There was no stopping Baron Jarm. He was a force of unstoppable nature. You sidestepped him, or he crushed you. Baron Burning Dog was, however, another matter. Ramus was a deadly mid-range threat, but his form was vulnerable in a way that Jarm's was not. Of course, a competent engineer would have known that someone with the words "hungry fire" in his epithet wouldn't be overly bothered by incendiary weapons. The baying dog had walked straight through RZ Awesome's fire mines and pinned the assault cohort in place for Jarm the Avalanche to flatten. There! I arrested my motion and came to a halt next to the mangled body of Dragon 88. There wasn't much of him left, but there was enough. Save points were durable little things, and mil-spec incarnations had a minimum of 5 secondary points, distributed about the body. They didn't have the real-time fidelity of a cranial primary, but since my Alpha Assault no longer had a head or a torso, he would be very glad that his body had been grown with backups in his shins, even if he wouldn't know why he should be grateful. The rescue pup unfolded from my belt and leapt to the ground. The tiny drone was barely the size of a hamster, but its industrial strength, carbon fiber jaws, shattered bone and stripped out cooked muscles with the ease of scooping warm butter. It took the pup all of 5 seconds to yank the tiny black marble from the corpse, at which point it hopped back onto its charging station and folded back into storage mode. It would clean the bone and gristle off the analog mind storage unit, prune the neurofibrils and coax open the interface. By the time I had the save point back to our respawn, it would be ready for reload and reincarnation. Twice more I was able to find and recover valid save points. The final point was a loss. Our Gamma Marauder was so utterly destroyed that there was nothing to recover. He was out of this battle. Next time, maybe he wouldn't let his incompetent engineers lull him into a false sense of security. He would lose all the experience from this battle, but that was a small price to pay for such a valuable lesson. A quick check showed that our respawn pod was skirting the edge of the engagement zone. In a regular Templar unit, there would have been a dedicated medical section, responsible for casualty management and reincarnations, but Black Force used automated pods instead. Our team had come into the fight with 60 blanks on ice. Enough for each of us to die in the field twice. The bodies were polymorphic and auto-adaptive. Pop in and be fighting ready in 2 minutes flat. Black Force exclusive, of course, but spending 3 months reacclimating and resynchronizing to a new incarnation was unacceptable. We shared the pool, so we were down to a mere 24 ready bodies. Early engagements had been brutal for both sides, and up until the fatal fuck-up at Lucan's Hollow, we had been churning through respawns fast. If I managed to get back to the respawn pod, then we would be back up to a fighting trim. Sure, we wouldn't be good as new. The Gamma assault was a write-off, and he wasn't alone. We had also had permanent casualties in our scout and marauder cohorts. We were down 2 scouts, and I was the sole survivor of the marauders. Far from ideal, but I could shoulder the burdens of the whole marauder cohort as long as I had some assaults to lean on. It was 39 kilometers to the respawn, more than half the distance of the entire engagement zone. It was 13 clicks to the red line that our substandard engineering cohort had drawn in the sand. From there, it was another 8 clicks to the yellow line, and then 13 more to the green zone. If I could manage to get over that yellow line, then I could consider myself home free. Right now, I was in enemy territory, and everyone and their mother knew where I was. The red zone was not controlled by our team in any real way. There were sensor platforms and various automated scout systems that populated the red zone, but deploying anything that constituted a weapons system was too much of a risk that close to the front. Not only might we own goal, but the other side wouldn't take that sort of thing lying down. Then the yellow zone was where I would find respite. That was where the active defenses were clustered. Minefields, Gracer emplacements, and rift generators galore. It took only about half a minute for something to go wrong. A peculiar rumbling in my chest, like a locomotive drawing ever nearer, pulled my eyes backwards to confirm the worst-case scenario. A plume of splinters and leaves traced a perfectly straight line through the jungle. It was like in the cartoons, when the funny little bird was running across the desert with the razor-sharp dust trail trailing behind him. Jarm, it seemed, had locked onto me and was building up a charge. My aerial telemetry clocked him at half the speed of sound and rising. I cursed behind my mask and engaged everything I had. My acceleration was sudden enough that without my Mobius, I would have been torn apart by the G-forces. Still, it wasn't going to be enough. The avalanche in hollow skin was already clocking in above my do-not-exceed velocity, and he would only get faster. Of all the lords that were on the battlefield, Yarm was the most difficult to deal with directly. The current accepted strategy on our side was to avoid him and achieve the objective without ever directly engaging him. Their strategy was the inverse: pin us down and let Jarm hammer us into paste. His plumb line of destruction threaded quickly through the firestorm, parting the still raging fires like a wave. He had broken the sound barrier, but was still accelerating, and I had less than 10 seconds before he crossed the 8 kilometers that stood between us. The titanic baron burst free of the inferno wreathed in a disk of plasma. He stood nearly 6 meters tall, broad in the beam, and vaguely describing the form of a man. He was grey-skinned and grossly muscular, though his muscles bulged unevenly and constantly shifted beneath that thick exterior. His hands were short and stubby with thick, horny nails, and his feet were like those of an elephant. Still, it was always his face that drew the most attention. It vaguely resembled the crushed and blunted face of a man, only with skin drawn over all the normal orifices. His features were always frozen in a mask of rage, but like the rest of him, his head bulged and shifted as the thing that wore that ill-fitting skin struggled to escape. My heart was in my throat. I wasn't certain if it was fear or excitement, but the thrill was so intense that I felt like my heart was pumping fire instead of blood. Jarm was the holy grail of the wild hunt. If you could somehow take him out of the fight you had all but won, there was a certain beauty to this moment. Me against Jam, the two biggest guns on either side facing off mano a mano. I was not just any alpha marauder, I was one of 7 marauders in the entire system designated as Apex. I was filling the alpha slot in the marauder cohort, but I was a ringer for my team. I jumped long and spun in the air. My bullpup repeater literally leapt into my hands, homing in on the magnetic plates in my gauntlets. There was a click as the first brace of micro-missiles locked into the chambers. No tricks, no subtlety, just a full hand of daisy-cutting thunderbirds. The weapon bucked and chattered as it spewed out bolts 6 at a time. All the weapon's stacked scram rails were loading and firing at maximum capacity, and the volume was such that the belt that fed it was writhing against my back like a snake. There was no point in shooting him with anything that I was carrying. Still, I had a ghost of a plan, and in the 5 seconds before Jam was inside my minimum safe repeater range, I had dumped more than half of my entire ammo reserves into the ground. My little 3mm KTJ repeater didn't have the power that the 9mm SARU monstrosities, the artillery cohort, lugged around, but it was still a repeater, and that many fusion bolts was enough to throw tons of dirt and dust into the air and carve the landscape near on as thoroughly as 20 years of strip mining. The avalanche hit the destruction I had caused without missing a stride, vanishing into the cloud. My penetrating radar would have normally been able to track him through the debris, but Jam's nature was that he didn't do business with physics like you or I. I hit the ground, and as I turned to leap off in a new direction, there was an enormous booming crunch as the Baron fell into one of the craters that I had carved in the ground and hit the wall at Mach 2. He wasn't harmed, that was for sure. Still burying himself under a few 100 tons of dirt, and water had bought me a few moments. I reoriented and started making my way towards the safety of my team territory at an oblique angle. The remote seismographic telemetry from our listening posts showed a sudden spike in activity, like a localized earthquake. The Baron was still moving, clawing his way up through the loam towards me. It would take him at least another 30 seconds to get up to speed. In the meantime, I had other things to worry about. Jam's pack was following hot on the heels of their lord, and the shivering screech that echoed across the landscape told me that he had chosen the twisted wolves of Goa. Jam wasn't exactly the most inspiring leader, so he didn't bring a full host, but still he was a baron, so he was entitled to his honor guard. It was widely considered that the wolves were the best choice the baron could make. White trolls were more dangerous, that was for certain, but the twisted wolves complemented the already unstoppable and deadly baron in a way that the straightforward lethality of the knighted trolls did not. I felt little thrills in my legs as they came shifting around the edge of the destruction that the avalanche and I had forged together. All the supernal creatures of the hunt were lovingly crafted and visually arresting, but I would say that the aesthetic of the twisted wolves of Agua is my personal favorite. They form the silhouette of a wolf mashed together with a man, but they are composed of coils of barbed wires and blade gears tangled together around a glowing heart of crimson crystal. They are pretty wicked to look at, but the way they move is pure poetry, shifting and forming themselves into new horrific configurations on the fly. The head might fall into the ground and become a leg, while what was once a leg would collapse into the main body, and the head would re-emerge from the twisting mass. The pack was near on a score in number, and they were booking it. They didn't have the raw speed that Jarm could manage, but they were still faster than me and could turn on a dime or stop on a penny and then be back up to maximum in as much time. They would be on me within moments, and the fountain of dirt that had just popped 1/2 kilometer up into the air meant that Jarm was out of the little antlion pit I had dropped him into. I laughed as my repeater tracked the leading edge of the wolf pack, and the pitch climbed up towards the manic as I switched from brace fire to continuous and held down the firing stud. My onboard targeting demon was handling some of the guidance, but at this range it was all on me. Thundercrack hypersonic bolts spewed from the weapon and tore into the closest wolf. My first few shots went wide and tore into the superfluous body of the creature, ripping up gears and wire that knitted back together as fast as it was destroyed. Number 4, however, got the job done. The tiny diamond needles struck the red crystal that pulsed at the center of the creature at near on Mach 7 and shattered in a spray of bloody shards. The shifting body of the monstrous golem slammed into the ground and collapsed into a chaotic jumble. Hundreds of tons of iron and copper burst forth like confetti from the shattered heart. It was almost like an explosion, but in slow motion. The blood of Gua, the forge god, contained within it a near infinite quantity of metal, and as long as it was contained in a crystal prison, it could be harnessed to give the twisted wolves their power. Now free, it spilled forth raw onto the Amazon basin. My maneuvering jets were firing in rapid sequence, making my fall chaotic and difficult to track. All around me the air was filled with the razor flechettes that the wolves used as their primary weapon. I was still firing, cracking 1, 2, 3 more crimson hearts as I hit the ground. I made my landing reversed, which was no small task, and skipped slightly to the side, evading a next storm of flechettes, then made my next jump. There was a mad woman wearing my skin. She was grinning enough to split her face and her heart hammered with excitement. This was it. This was the moment. There was a cool satisfaction to doing your job well, to the patient competence that one fights. Yet it was in these moments where fate dumped you onto an avalanche and gave you a tune to dance to that made this all worthwhile. I was living in that instant, firing repeater missiles as fast as I could rack them. Blinding, befuddling, misdirecting, striking, feinting, fighting. At least I was, until I heard it. Jarm was mute when it came to words, but he had a sound to him. It was like a constant avalanche that varied in intensity from deafening to battering. It was why we called him the Avalanche, and he was hot on my heels. At first it was a trilling rumble, a light touch on my earlobe. It grew and grew until it was louder than the chaos of the screeching wolves and metal on metal. The tone shifted, and suddenly I realized that I was wrong, and it wasn't Yarm at all. My heart dropped into my stomach. It was my phone. My work line and the caller ID said it was the red desk, and that meant only one thing. The timing couldn't have been worse. If I logged off now, we were done. My team was going to lose, not only me, but all of the save points I was carrying. Worse, I couldn't ignore this call. I was on duty, so it was my ethical responsibility to pick it up. And morally, it would be a disgusting failure. Worse, practically, it would be useless. I was physically at work right now. If I didn't pick up, someone was going to walk the 10 meters from the offices to the break room and poke me. I beamed my squad a quick apology, jumped into all chat, and gave the other team a similar missive, and then logged out of the match. My Black Force message box instantly lit up with a half-dozen messages. Skullexor, Lord wanted to let me know I was a festering cunt sore. But Becton Rule, who was playing as Remus for the other team, and Curl, our Alpha Scout, had both sent me their best wishes. We hung out together enough that they knew why I had to go. There was a start as my reticular system reactivated and reality crashed back into existence. I was sitting on the break room couch, right where I had been when I logged onto the Black Force server 2.5 hours ago. My feet propped up on a chair I had appropriated from the kitchen, neck cradled by a little inflatable pillow I kept around for this very purpose. I groaned from the cramp of sore muscles, left too long in one position. I pulled my legs up to my chest to stretch some of the pain out, and had Nervash transfer the call to my internal comm. I took one long pause to get my mind back into the real world, then opened the line. Deacon Inspector McLauglin, PsychoCIDE. I spoke the words with as much gravitas as I could muster, with a painful cramp in my thigh. There was a torrent of excited jabbering from the red desk. The details came in a jumble, out of order and confused, but the basic gist was that someone had lost their mind in the most literal way possible. Used to be that you could only get an extra life in a game. That was no longer true. Black Force had some fantastic elements, like that silly respawn pod, but it was my favorite, because for the most part it was a completely realistic simulation. Just like you can lose a save file. There are ways you can corrupt, delete, or otherwise screw the save point system of a mind, and needless to say, it isn't like losing your high score. Hence the need for a PsychoCIDE division in the local constabulary. I gave myself a long 10 count, and then levered myself out of the couch. I flashed my partner a quick message and went forth to save the day.